Now I bet you're familiar with the word peace. Two versions, probably. And I bet you're familiar with the word building. But if you're like anyone else I've ever met in my entire life, you're not familiar with the word peace building. But contrary to what spell check thinks, it is indeed a real word, which is good because I've been studying it for 4 semesters at college. I'm learning to transform violent opposition into constructive change. I'm learning to run toward conflict instead of away. I'm learning to dig into it instead of covering it up. And I'm learning to love its potential instead of fearing its pain. As part of that, I got to spend 3.5 months in Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Egypt. Now, I can't summarize everything I learned. I've actually really been struggling to figure out what to say today because I lived in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for 3.5 months. How can I summarize without excluding an identity or sugarcoating or oversimplifying and without exceeding my time limit? Turns out I can't. Not even gonna try. Instead, I'm going to introduce you to the first steps of peace building as I came to understand them on my travels. When I first found out I was going on this trip, I remembered almost nothing about the conflict in Israel and Palestine. I knew that the Jews returned to Israel and fought to establish a state in 1948. I had vague memories of UN resolutions and refugees and about a 6-day war and a Yom Kippur war, which I definitely thought were the same thing and which definitely aren't. I think in general, I just thought that the Jews came home and it caused some friction that escalated into a war that displaced Palestinians. And if the Israelis and the Palestinians could just figure out how to care for the refugees, everything else would just work itself out. I'm very glad I kept that to myself. So I've learned a lot, mostly that all of my assumptions were very wrong. But I also learned, most importantly, that everybody has their own story. And that those stories create a narrative that affects how we perceive the world around us. And how we perceive the world around us affects how we interact with that world. So if I want to change actions, I need to change perceptions. And if I want to change perceptions, I need to change narrative. And if I want to change the narrative, I need to tell different stories. To show you a little bit more of what I mean, I'm going to share with you part of my learning process. These are some of the stories that taught me. The first time my narrative was really challenged was when we traveled to Bethlehem and lived in homestays. Before then, we'd been studying Judaism and the environmental effects of conflict in a kibbutz, a socialist community in the southern Negev desert. Bethlehem was a completely different story. To get into the city, and any time you want to leave, you have to pass through checkpoints. And sometimes it felt like everywhere you looked, there were soldiers staring at us. One day in one of our lectures, we heard from a leader of the First Intifada. The Intifadas are usually characterized as Palestinian revolts against the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. But to our lecturer, the first one at least, was so much more. It was a way of taking back his identity. So he started with the story of his grandma, who grew up in a village where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side as neighbors and best friends, which is kind of unheard of right now. And then he told us his uncle's story about learning that nonviolence was a form of empowerment as a way to take control of his life. And then he told us his experiences in the First Intifada. He talked about events, for lack of a better term, where people would just go to the roof of their apartment building and make a lot of noise for like 15 or 20 minutes at a time, just to say that they were there and they could organize. He talked about Palestinian women who would hang their laundry in the shape of the Palestinian flag because it was illegal to fly one. So they would put their reds in a triangle on the side, and then their blacks, greens, and whites and stripes coming off, so that if you looked from above or you looked up from below, you saw the Palestinian flag. He told us about the Wanted 18, which is actually a herd of 18 cows that Palestinians bought to challenge the Israeli dairy industry in the West Bank. To him, it was not a story of revolt, but a movement to reclaim Palestinian lives. Of course, it was a little violent, and we asked him about this. The second Intifada was much more violent. And when we asked him, his face fell. He said, you know, the Geneva Conventions say that if you're living in occupation, it is legal to violently oppose that occupation. He said it's really hard to convince people not to when they know that internationally it's legal, and that when they see that violence against them. But he also went on to tell us about a program he started to train nonviolent Palestinian leaders. His story was so inspiring. Listening to him and to other stories in Bethlehem, I was introduced to a life spent resisting oppression. I met refugees who still had the keys to their old houses, and I was reminded that the wars I was learning about affected the real people around me. I could feel my perception swinging toward Palestine. And then, 2 months later, my perception shifted again when we went to live in a settlement. A settlement is a protected Jewish town inside the West Bank. International courts have ruled them illegal, and we had been hearing stories and witnessing abusive relationships between settlers and their Palestinian neighbors for pretty much the whole trip. And at first, we weren't really surprised. A man implied that if we supported Palestinians, we supported ISIS. A woman told us that it was time the Palestinians were kicked out of Israel once and for all and sent to live in the Sinai. And my host family, though wonderfully welcoming, questioned my social views, they questioned my pacifism, and they questioned my faith. In all honesty, I was beginning to shut down. And then against all odds, I made a friend in a synagogue. She is a year younger than me, and at the time, that meant that she was just starting her mandatory service in the military. She knew we'd spent time in the West Bank, and so she started off by telling me what a great relationship her settlement had with the Palestinian neighbors around them. To kind of prove her point, she talked about one of her best friends in high school, who was Palestinian, the janitor. Obviously, there's a power difference there, but I was really surprised because she really thought that this relationship we had with her janitor was a genuine friendship. And then, to explain her confusion with this Palestinian friend and her dedication to army service, she told another story. A few months before we came, she was hitchhiking home from Jerusalem, and as they approached the traffic circle that led into her community, they saw a whole bunch of emergency lights. So she told the driver, she said, "You can let me off here. I see my brother-in-law over there. He's a paramedic. So you can let me out here, and I'll just go meet up with him. You can try and avoid the traffic." So she grabbed her bag, got out of the car, and started walking toward her brother-in-law. He turned around, saw her, and yelled, "Run!" So she ran. She had walked into a terrorist attack. Violent Palestinian extremists were using the confusion to stab Israelis. She found herself in a bus station next to an armed Israeli soldier, waiting until it was safe to go home. She remembers that she couldn't stop shaking. For the first time, I understood Israeli fear. It doesn't justify the occupation, but the occupation doesn't justify that stabbing. For what must have been the 1,000th time on this trip, my perceptions started to shift again. The final story I'm going to tell you is often silenced. Israelis didn't talk about it, Palestinians in the West Bank didn't talk about it, and when we asked, nobody had any answers. And so I made a promise that I was not going to contribute to that silencing when I got back, and so I'm going to keep telling this story, and I'm not going to stop until hopefully one day I won't need to tell it. So I'm going to introduce you to Gaza. That in the distance is Gaza, seen from a Jewish farming community right over the border. We spoke, I don't have time to tell you everything I learned, but I can tell you a little bit of what one Gazan told us when she managed to get a permit out for the day. In her words, life in Gaza is unpredictable. 60% of Gazans under the age of 30 are unemployed, and suicide rates are rising. Doctors have started diagnosing permanent traumatic stress disorder, and the UN estimates that 300,000 Palestinian children are in need of psychological care that they don't have access to. She told us that Gazans get 2 to 4 hours of electricity every day, if they can afford it, and 2 hours of water that's mostly sewage. The UN also estimates that Gaza will be unlivable by 2020. 2 years. Since Hamas took control of Gaza in 2007, Israel has launched 3 offensives into the Gaza Strip, 2008, 2012, and 2014. This is a close-up of the Gaza border wall with a remote control machine gun on top. During those offensives, Hamas hides in their extensive tunnel system under the city, and most of the casualties are women and children. Our speaker told us that everybody has lost something. She lost a nephew, her cousin lost her legs, and her sister lost an eye. She says, we have been reduced to numbers. They say how many people died and not who died. She says we are numbers now, but we are not numbers. She says we are people with hopes and dreams. She says, I don't know what it feels like to not be afraid. We are living dead in Gaza. Telling stories is not the be-all and end-all of peace building, but it is a beginning, and it's a vital first step to changing the narrative that changes the perceptions, that changes action. In listening to stories, we are held accountable to truths that make us feel uncomfortable. It is easier to sit nicely in the knowledge that my side is right than to consider the idea that maybe their side is too. It is easy to justify occupation when all you know is fear. And it is easy to explain away violent resistance when all you know is oppression. Listening to stories makes us face truths that we'd rather ignore, and telling our own stories forces others to do the same thing. Every story has something to add to the conversation. So whether that conversation is about Israel and Palestine and Gaza, or whether it's about politics in the US right now, which I'm kind of more afraid of than the Middle East, or whether it's about why your soccer team just can't get along anymore, change the narrative, change the perceptions, change the actions. Go, tell your story.